Tea time, yeah, making a difference, one cup at a time. Tea time, yeah. So be sure to grab your tea, grab a seat, and tune in to Miss Liz. Tea time, making a difference, one cup at a time. Tea time, yeah. Tea time, time.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is tea time. That's right. Miss Liz is here, and we are doing an evening tea time. We are doing different tonight. Tonight we have horror stories. That's right. We're going dark, we're going deep, and we're going ready for a heavy, heavy tea. So, but a heavy, good tea. So I'm going to do the disclaimer, get all that stuff out of the way, introduce my incredible guest, Philip Fracassi. I hope I'm saying his last name right. If not, I'll get him to say it when he gets up on the screen. But just so that you know, this tea time is only for information, nothing else. Disclaimer for Miss Liz's Tea Times live show. Miss Liz myself is going live using StreamYard. Before leaving a comment, please grant StreamYard permission to see your name at StreamYard.com. Please be advised that the content brought forward for any Tea Time show hosted by myself, Miss Liz, is always brought forward in good faith, however, may bring forth dialogue and opinions that are not representative of my platform. The facts and information are perceived to be accurate at the given time of airing. All Tea Time guests and audience participants are responsible for using their good judgment in taking any action that may relate to their discussion. The content brought forward may include discussions for some where they may be emotionally at risk. It is significant to note that this show is engaging in discussion forums only to offer and inspire awareness and connection. It is not providing therapeutical advice. If you have any questions about this disclaimer or the panelist discussion, you may freely contact me, Miss Liz, through my email at bookingmissliz@gmail.com. Moving forward, should you choose to voluntarily participate in this show, in any aspect, I, Miss Liz, welcomes you. Should you decide that the show is not made for you at this time, I respect that, and I will see you at a future show at a later date. Now, let me bring in my incredible guest, Philip Fracassi, but a little intro before Philip jumps in, and then we're going to have a good dark tea. We're going to do some horror. We're going to understand a little bit more on Philip Fracassi. Philip Fracassi is an author of the award-winning story collection, Behold the Void, which won Best Collection of the Year. From this is the Horror and Strange Aeons magazine. His newest collection, Beneath a Pale Sky, was published in 2021 by Lethe Press. It received a star review from Library Journal, was named Best Collection of the Year by Rue Morgue Magazine, and was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. His novels include A Child Alone with Strangers, Gothic, and Boys in the Valley. And to learn more on Philip, you can check out his full bio on Miss Liz's Facebook page, LinkedIn, and Instagram. All of that good stuff is all there. So I'm going to welcome Philip into the studio with me tonight. Welcome, Philip. It's nice to have you here.
Hi, Liz. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So I hope I'm saying your last name right.
Pretty close. Fracassi.
Fracassi.
No, it's just like a C at the end. Fracassi. It's kind of like lasagna. Fracassi. Yeah. It's kind of
like
kind
lasagna. Okay. Got it. Little dark humor there. We're going to throw it in there, right? So I want to get right into it with you, Philip, tonight. How did it all begin, and why horror stories?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think I was, when I was a youngster, I kind of grew up reading horror. I'm a child of the 80s, and I think I fell in love with Stephen King and Clive Barker and Peter Straub and Dean Koontz and all the kind of the heavy hitters from that time. And I was a young teenager, and those are just the stories I fell in love with and I gravitated to. And then and I've always been a writer, but I haven't always written horror. I wrote literary fiction for many years. I wrote a few novels, but I wasn't having much success. And then about 7 years ago now, I decided to try my hand at genre fiction, specifically horror, and things really took off for me. And it's been a really fun ride ever since then. So it seems like I found my niche.
Well, I think we all have to find our niche once in a while, right?
Yeah.
So you just mentioned that you did write other books. So I did find that you wrote children's books and poetry.
Yeah. So I'm kind of, yeah. So the books, a lot of the, I wrote 3 novels, kind of in my 30s. And one of them is coming out from a small press, but the other 2 will probably never see the light of day. But yeah, but now I write horror, but I also, I like to kind of diversify. I kind of write what I want. So the thing about writing today, I think publishing today, is you can have kind of a diverse stable of publishers. So I have some books coming out that are very commercial, that are genre books, that are, that are coming out with bigger presses. And then when I want to do something like a book of poetry or a children's book, there's a lot of small presses now that you can go to who will publish those, if they're quality and if they're interested in it. So yeah, so I kind of like to do different things. I just wrapped up a science fiction novel that's being shopped right now by my agent. So I kind of, I kind of like to sort of play in different sandboxes, but primarily horror. The subgenre of horror that I write is more like supernatural thrillers or speculative horror. It's versus like kind of like serial killers and body horror, that kind of stuff. It's not really what I do. I write more thrillers that have sort of a speculative element.
Yeah, well, I noticed I checked out quite a few of your books, and I noticed that there was always a family history in most of your stories of mental health or stuff like that as well. So I kind of noticed that in a lot of your books, because I checked out about 8 or 9 of your books, and I was like, oh my goodness, like there's a pattern here in most of your books. So is there a reason for all of those background stories, or?
Well, for me, I feel like the best way to involve a reader with a story is to connect them with the characters. And so I'm very, I take a lot of time to develop my characters. I give them, backstories. I make them, fully fleshed out. They have real feelings and real emotions, and they're not, they're imperfect a lot. They're not necessarily always people that you like or would want to hang out with, but they're real people for the most part. And it's important to me because I feel like, especially with what I do, which is scaring people or giving people, making them feel an emotional response that, or be afraid or whatever. I think it's always best to slowly immerse them in the story and get them really into that world and into those characters' minds and heads, and connect them with this, and then really ground them in sort of the reality of the story. And then when the scary stuff starts, I think it has more of an impact for the reader. I think it does a better job of giving them a visceral reaction and making it maybe in a more emotional reaction as well. So that's kind of why, for me specifically, I like to really focus on character building as well as this, the scares.
Well, that's good because it gives it builds a plot, right?
Yeah.
And I want to go into, I noticed that you're a screenwriter. So for all of the viewers and listeners out there that don't know what a screenwriter is, could you share a little bit on what that is?
Yeah. So, like I said, I've been writing for a long time, but yeah, around 2010, I got an opportunity to write a screenplay for a Disney Entertainment, so a children's movie, and I did, and I ended up writing about 7 of those movies for them, and then I started writing screenplays for other movies. So, but what a screenplay is, I'm sorry to answer your question directly. Screenplay is basically just like the when you see a movie or a TV show, a screenplay is literally what happens in that movie or TV show, what the characters say, what the action is, where people, what people do, all that stuff is kind of laid out in a screenplay. A screenplay is different than a novel in that it's really just action and dialogue. You're not creating a setting. There's no prose involved. It's basically this person says this and then they do this. So it's a totally different kind of skill set. But the thing that's interesting about writing screenplays is, unlike maybe short stories or novels, screenplays are much more structured. There's kind of there's kind of a framework that you have to sort of follow to tell a story. And there's a lot of books about screenplay writing and telling a story in a structured way. The 3-act structure, 15 beats, which is like a beat is like a point of action that carries the story along. So writing all those screenplays back, about 10 years ago or whatever, really affected the way I started writing fiction, because I started writing, my fiction became much more story structured. And I think that is one of the reasons I've had some success with the stuff I've been writing more recently, because I feel like I'm telling the story better than maybe I was, 20 years ago or whatever. So that's one thing I've applied to my fiction. But now I'm still writing screenplays. I just finished writing a feature screenplay that's based on one of my short stories. But I'm also writing a novel at the same time. So I'm kind of doing both now.
Wow, you're really, really busy, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty busy.
So what movies did you write a screenplay for Disney?
The only one I got a credit for, because a lot of times what you do is you write as what's called a work for hire, which basically means they pay you to write a screenplay, but they don't necessarily give you a credit. But I did get a credit for a movie that I wrote for them called the Santa Paws 2, the Santa Pups. So I did a lot of the talking dog movies like Air Buds and stuff like that. So I did a lot of the puppy movies. So talking dogs and, jokes and, silly jokes for kids and stuff like that. And then I also wrote a movie that was on Lifetime television called Girl Missing. And that was produced about, I want to say 7 years ago. It was first aired. And I've written a couple other screenplays that haven't not been produced yet. And hopefully this movie I just finished will go into production next year, and maybe we'll see it in 2024. So fingers crossed. It's called Death, My Old Friend, which is based on my short story of the same name.
Oh, wow. Wow. So how long does it take you generally to write a book?
To write a novel, it takes a while. So the way I work is, every writer kind of has their own way of working. But the way I work is I kind of come up with the core idea. I sort of think about it. I read a lot of stuff about that idea. I'll kind of let it, stew in my head for a little bit. But then I go to outline, and I create a very extensive outline, a kind of a chapter by chapter breakdown of what happens in the book. And that process usually takes about a month. And then I start writing once I feel like I know exactly what's going to happen in the book. And who the characters are and all that kind of good stuff. Then I start the actual, writing process. And once I start writing, it usually takes me about, I would say between 6 to 8 weeks to write a first draft. But then you edit. So then I go through and I edit the whole draft again. And that takes another, few weeks. And then I usually do a second edit, and that takes a couple of weeks. And then you give it to, if you sell it to an editor, or to a publisher, then they give you edits, and you have to kind of do it all over again. So it takes a while, to kind of do all those rewrites. But usually from beginning to end, from idea to first draft being completed, takes me about 3 months.
Oh, that's not bad.
No, and I move pretty fast. I write a little bit faster than the norm. So for those who are out there writing novels or thinking about writing a novel, don't use me as a guideline necessarily, because I write faster than probably most writers even do. So I think for a lot of people, it can take 6 months. Sometimes it can take a year. It's also really about what your lifestyle is, how much time you can commit to it. I write full time. So when I'm working on a big project like a novel, that's all I'm doing. I'm at my desk like 10 hours a day, just writing. So it's my job. So I don't want anyone to feel like bad if it takes them a lot longer to write something, because it
does take time to write a book.
Yeah.
Because I'm working on books, and it's like taking time, and I'm getting frustrated with myself because I'm like, why can I not just get it done, right?
Yeah, and like I said, people have different styles. Like I know a lot of writers who their goal is like they write 500 words a day, which is essentially like 2 pages. So, and that's like, that's it. And they write those 500 words. And if they get those 500 words every day, if you do the math, in a year, they have a novel. I tend to write more in, streaks. So I'll sit down, and there are some days where I might only get a couple hundred words down. And then there are some days where I'll write 10,000. So, it really I kind of go with the flow on those things. And if I'm not finding, a good groove, I'll work on something else, or I'll research something, or, I'll apply myself somewhere else. But yeah, I think if you can get, I tell people, new writers, I say, if you can make a goal, whatever your goal is, make it your goal based on your life and what you have going on. So if it's 200 words a day, if it's 500 words a day, if it's 1,000 words a day, if it's, then do what you can. But it does add up. You'd be surprised. If you do that consistently for, 4 or 5, 6 months, you'll find yourself with a lot of words. So, and I also tell people, don't overthink it. Just write it, get that first draft done, and then go back and you can worry about all the stuff you don't like. But while you're writing, just get it down on paper. And again, you'll be surprised at how much easier it is if you're not overthinking it too much.
I think that's where I am. I'm overthinking it too much, and that's where I'm getting the frustration. But it is true. When we're writing, we should just flow. The edits can get done later, and if it doesn't make sense, it can get all fixed later, right?
Exactly. And I think that's the best way to write, because otherwise it becomes too frustrating. And I think you put roadblocks up on yourself, and it's just, and you may not even use the 500 words you wrote, but they're there. And once you get, the thing about writing is, once you kind of get going, it's smooth. The road gets smoother. So I find a lot of times the hardest part of a story or a book to write is the first sentence, right? Because you're like sweating over that first sentence or that first paragraph. So I try not to worry about that too much. I try and just start doing it, and then things I get into a flow and things kind of smooth out. And then I'll go back and I'll look at that first sentence again or that first paragraph again, and I'll work on sweetening it up. But yeah, the key is just to kind of plow through. The axiom I like to use is, when skating on thin ice, your safety is in your speed. So, you know what I mean? So you just got to kind of like keep going, and you'll get across that lake.
Oh, well, that's awesome. So what have you learned about yourself through the writing of and creating the thrill of horror stories? Because I know you have done other genres, but through the horror, what have you learned about yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I've learned a lot of empathy. Not that I didn't have empathy before, but I think you force yourself to see the world through different eyes and through different characters' perspectives. And you write all sorts of different characters, right? You write, you write men, you write women, you write people with different ethnic backgrounds, you write people in different diverse backgrounds, and I think you kind of have to you kind of force yourself to walk in their shoes a little bit, and you force yourself to sort of get to look at see the world through their eyes. And it kind of it helps create a broader understanding of how people generally think and feel. And I think it creates I think it gives me as a person a little more empathy, because, it's like that old saying, walk a mile in my shoes. And I think it's kind of like that. If you walk a little bit in someone else's shoes, maybe you can you have a little bit of different take on different things. So that, I think, is probably the one thing I've learned the most in writing horror specifically. I've gotten pretty good at scaring people. I think I've gotten pretty good at knowing what works and what doesn't, what people respond to and what they don't. I've done some trial and error. I've written, to this point, I've published over 20, I think like 25 stories, and I've got 3 novels coming out. So I've kind of had I've had enough feedback at this point where I think I've learned what buttons maybe are better to push to get somebody.
So you've written 25 books already?
No, it's 25. I published 25 stories.
Oh, stories.
Yeah, no, I have 3 books coming out in the next year. So 3 novels.
Oh, wow. Well, you said it roughly about 3 months to write a novel. So that's 9 months.
Yeah, I usually give it's draining. Yeah, it takes me, I'd say I mean, all in, it's about, to your point, about 9 months to a year by the time the novel's ready to be published. Yeah, it takes a while, on and off, for about a year.
So roughly every year you're releasing three novels.
Oh, I would say at this point I'll probably be cutting that back to like 1 a year. I have a book coming out in October. I have a book coming out in February, and then I have a book coming out in July, and then I have a book of stories coming out October 2023, and then I have another novel that I've already sold for June 2024. So that's all done. So now everything I'm writing, and I have a couple of novels being shopped by my agent. So at this point, I'm trying to write about a book a year, so that I can kind of, as 2024 and beyond, maybe put out like a book, maybe 2 books a year at the most. Yeah.
So all the books that you're writing now are coming out in 2023.
All the books I'm writing now probably won't be coming out until 2024 and beyond, because all the books that are coming out next year I've already written and delivered, so they're already with the publishers.
Oh my goodness. So he's already working for 2024.
Yeah, you have to kind of, you pretty much are, when you sell a book, the general rule of thumb is that book's probably going to come out in about 18 months to 2 years. So I'm selling stuff that, like, if I were to sell a book tomorrow, it would not come out at this point until, best case scenario, the end of 2024 or early 2025. So everything that I'm actually working on right now is for like 2 years down the road.
Wow.
Yeah, you got to think way ahead in this business.
Yeah. Well, that's how it is, right? The flow of the words, they just keep flowing out.
Yeah, and it just takes a long time. The publishing process takes a while, and they have publishers have a lot of books coming out, so they kind of, they kind of put you in the schedule, and they have to design the cover, and they have to do the proofreading, and they got to do the layout, and so all that stuff takes time.
Yeah.
And they got to print the book, and that these days that takes longer than it used to, because there's a paper shortage, and there's been some printer issues with COVID that happened, and so everything's takes a little bit longer now than it used to.
Well, everything's going electronic now, right? So it's hard to get a hard copy book.
Yeah, I think ebooks are pretty popular for sure. Audiobooks are gaining a lot of popularity as well. So when I sell a book, I usually sell it. The publisher has the rights to do the book in print. They have the rights to do the book as an electronic book, and they have the rights to do an audiobook. So yeah, so they kind of put out all those formats. Print books still have a pretty good sales record. I sell more print books than I do ebooks, but not by much. Ebooks are pretty popular for sure.
So what's the difference between an ebook and an audiobook?
Audiobook is like if you're in your car listening to a book on the, through your stereo system. It's like, via like Audible or Spotify or whatever. And then ebook is like if you have a Kindle and you're reading it on a screen versus holding it in your hand, holding a print book in your hand.
Awesome. So how many years have you been writing, Philip?
I've been writing professionally now since 2010. But I've been writing, my whole life. I've always wanted to be, since I was 10 years old, I wanted to be a writer. It's all I ever did. I would, during math class in 7th grade, I would be, I was writing, scary stories. And, I tried to write I tried to write my first novel when I was, I think, like 14 or 15. And I didn't finish it because I got frustrated, but because it was a science fiction novel. And I realized I didn't know all the technology that I needed to know for the story to work. And I remember that being a very frustrating experience. And I wish I just, cause I didn't know, but I had fun writing the story. And, but yeah, and I've written like 3 novels since then over call it my 20s and 30s. And then, that were never released. So I was always writing, and I was always trying to be a professional writer, but it really wasn't until 2015 when I sold my first story. And then in 2016, I sold my first collection of stories as a book. And it was really just about 2 years ago, I sold my first novel. And since then, things have been kind of speeding up. So it's been an interesting, last few years have been really interesting. Lots been happening.
So have you done any collaborations with any other authors?
I personally have not, but I know a lot of writers who do that. I would like to at some point. I think it'd be a lot of fun, and I have a lot of friends who are writers, so I would love to, do something with one of my pals. But I haven't done it to date. But I do know a lot of writers who have done that. There's actually, a couple anthologies, which is a collection of stories written by different authors, where all, the theme of the anthology is that all the stories are collaborative. So they're all, 2 or 3 different writers all working on the same story. So it's always intrigued me, but I've never had the opportunity to do it. But
so is that something you would like to, right?
Yeah, at some point. Yeah, when I have time. When I find time. Yeah, I would like
yeah,
to,
he's like writing for 2024 already. Like
yeah, I know. I'm a little behind the 8 ball, but it would be something fun to do. I think it'd just be finding the right situation. So
So if the youths out there that are listening and that will watch the replay later, Philip, if they'd like to get into writing, what tips and tools would you have for them?
Well, like I said earlier, I think the best thing to do is to, to find what works for you. I think there's a lot of bad information out there. And I think, there's a lot of, you'll hear, a lot of people, you hear the thing, well, writers, if you're, want to be a writer, you have to write every day. And I don't like that advice because I don't think it's realistic. And I think it's puts up barriers for people. And I think the way I would say it is find your time to write. And if that's an hour a day, great. If it's an hour a week, great. If because everyone's got complicated lives, and they have families and they have jobs, and so I always say but once you make that decision, stick to it. That's the thing. So it's like if you're going to write every Tuesday night for 2 hours, then write every Tuesday night for 2 hours. And set that time as that you're go in the office and close the door and work time. And I would just say, just try and be consistent with it. I mean, the biggest hurdle to becoming a successful writer is perseverance, because even after you create short stories or if you write a novel, that's just really the beginning, because then you have to find someone to publish it. And you're going to have a lot of people who will reject you and who will turn the novel or story down. And that gets very frustrating, but you just have to kind of keep going and keep going and keep going. So it's really about perseverance. It's really a marathon. One person, a writer, told me once when I was just starting out, he said, my timeline, what I always tell new writers is it takes about 10 years to get to achieve any sort of, moderate success or whatever you view as success from the time you start working on it. So I don't know about that. I think it depends on luck and, market and all that kind of thing. But yeah, so my advice would be just find what works for you and stay consistent with it, and don't waver from that. It's kind of like going to the gym. Like, all right, I'm going to go to the gym every Monday for 2 hours. I'm not going to not do it or whatever. And I think it's just like, you have to kind of apply yourself. And the other advice I would give is to read a lot, because I do believe that to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. And I think not necessarily writing for if you write romance novels, I don't think you necessarily have to read romance. I think it would help, but just read anything, because reading it not only generates ideas, but it also it gives you a sense of language. It gives you a sense of story pacing. If you read nonfiction, it can generate a lot of cool ideas for you to consider for your story. So I always say read widely and find that time to write and stick to it. And just, like I said earlier, even if it's 250 words a day, if you do that consistently for 3-4 months, next thing you know, you've got a lot of words down on paper. So that's my advice.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Philip. I want to ask you, is there a list of different types of horror stories and horror films? Like, is there a different degree, like extreme horror? Like, is there different levels or titles that are given for horror?
Yeah, it's funny. I just wrote an article about this exact thing, about genres and subgenres and stuff like that. And yeah, there is. And I think with any genre, you have subgenres. So in fantasy, you have dark fantasy or urban fantasy. In science fiction, you have hard science fiction, which is where it's more technical. In horror, you have what's called quiet horror, which is where it's more like literary and spooky, but not necessarily violent or gory or whatever. There's probably no zombies and that kind of stuff. And then you have kind of more mainstream horror, which is zombies and ghosts and that kind of stuff. And then you have kind of what I call like, speculative maybe horror, which is, or thrillers, which is kind of like where it's kind of a little bit more where it's more about the story, and the horror is kind of an element of the story, but the story is the main thing. And it's more character based for the most part. It tends not to have, trope villains like vampires and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of subgenres, and it's tricky because there are, it's actually too bad, because I think there's a lot of people who would really enjoy a lot of books that are classified as horror, but don't read it because they're like, oh, I don't like to be scared, or I don't like monsters, or I don't like gross, things, or I don't like serial killers or whatever it is. But like anything, there's such a diverse, range of content within the horror genre. So it's kind of like you almost have to kind of drill down a little bit deeper to see what kind of writing it is, what kind of story it is. And it can be tricky. And there's also what I call, what's called slipstream or crossover or genre bending, which basically is just a fancy, another way of saying you kind of take two genres and you sort of mush them together. So in my book that's coming out in October, it's called A Child Alone with Strangers. It's really a hybrid novel. It's crime. It's like a traditional crime novel, like a police procedural where they're trying to find clues and find out what happened to this child, and they're investigating and they're, running down leads. And the other half of the novel is, really horror in the sense that there's people with special powers, and there's a monster in the woods, and there's kind of more, that supernatural element. And the two things are kind of combined together into one big book. So, that's kind of speculative fiction is kind of, you can kind of play with different genres. Just like science fiction, there can be science fiction mysteries like Blade Runner, or there can be, fantasies that are also kind of sci-fi. So you can there's a lot of genre blending. So it's kind of complicated, and it's too bad because I do think that there are people who read more mainstream fiction who I think would get a lot out of a lot of books that are classified as horror, but maybe are wary to go there. So the best thing to do is to ask like your librarian or your bookseller and say, this is the kind of book I like, this is an author that I like. What other authors are like that author? I think that's a better way to do it versus like trying to do it by category or by genre. Start with the authors you like and ask someone who's widely read, what are other authors who would maybe be in that same vein.
Do you feel that horror movies and stories can actually be educational for students and children?
That's a tough question. I don't.
I asked the hard ones.
I think I want to say yes because this is what I do for a living. But I know the way I look at my stories personally, or my novels, or my screenplays, or whatever. I tend to look at it more as entertainment. My thinking is I'm creating this as a distraction. So if you're sitting in an airport for a couple hours, or you're at home and you want to lose yourself in a book, I think of it more as entertainment. I don't know the educational value of stories and films in the horror field. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a lesson to be learned for that would be considered educational. But you never know. I think if you wanted to be a horror writer, then they're definitely educational because you're learning how to write scary stuff and how to write, prose and how to write great fiction. So in that sense, yeah. But I think you're probably not going to come out of it with a higher SAT score after reading a bunch of horror novels. I don't think.
Well, the reason that I asked that question, Philip, was because I'm big on education, right?
Sure.
And you're mentioning all these subgenres and all that, but you have to understand them and you have to learn them, right? So that's kind of like education, like you're educating yourself on understanding the different genres. And for me, when I look at a horror story or a horror movie or anything like that, I see history. I see a lot of history.
Sure.
A lot of the past, right? The monsters, the zombies, the castles, the vampires. So I see a lot of history. So I find it, for myself, I find it very educational when I watch it. But it does make sense that it's entertainment. But entertainment for me is educational because I'm just a big old nerd. So
yeah, I mean, it's a good point. For example, I wrote a story called Shiloh, which is a horror story but it takes place during the Battle of Shiloh during the Civil War. And I had to research the Battle of Shiloh. I researched it for weeks, and I learned all about the battle, and I learned the people who were there, and I learned, about the kind of guns they used and the kind of cannons they used and what kind of uniforms they wore, because it had to be realistic, right? So that's a good point, which I think as you get into period pieces specifically, yeah, that you can definitely learn a lot about history or Gothic, novels. You can learn a lot about medieval times and stuff like that. So that is a good point. There is that element. And I think even reading things like science fiction, which can be a hybrid with horror. You learn a lot about science. And I wrote a book called Observe, which is a time travel thriller. And same thing. I researched a lot of the science behind theoretical time travel, about wormholes, about what kind of time machine would make sense, about data encryption, and I had to learn I had to read and learn all these things so that I could write a realistic science fiction story. So there is that element of absolutely. I think there are a lot of stories and novels like that where you come out, and also you're just learning a little bit more about the world. I think you're learning more about, like I said earlier, I think you're learning more about people, and if you take out the scary stuff, you are reading about different people in different settings. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about horror, at least lately over the last few years, it's really diversified. There's been a lot more writers are kind of emerging who have really diverse backgrounds and come from different countries, or just have different economic statuses, and they talk a lot. Their stories are very reflective of their culture, or their economic background, or their heritage, or whatever it is, and all that stuff is really fascinating to me. So I think, to your point, which I think is an excellent point, you do learn about people, and you learn about their experiences that you may not be familiar with, but where you live, or the kind of people that you're surrounded by. It may be eye-opening to you to realize that there are those kind of people in the world, and if it's told in an entertaining way, like through a horror story, it might be a great way to educate yourself on that.
Well, and that's what entertainment is, right? It's to teach us different aspects and different ways of looking, perspectives of looking, right? So I want to really thank you, Philip, for sharing that, because I want to really, for the viewers and listeners out there, to understand that in order to serve a good cup of tea, we have to understand the time travel. And I love that you talked about time travel, because now we're going to get into your tea and what makes your tea. Because this is what we do here at Tea Time, is we serve tea, but we serve education. For me, my tea is teaching educational awareness. So, Philip, if I asked you what your tea is, what would your tea be?
Oh, well, it doesn't go as well as yours is, but what I come up with was, things that describe, I think, what I do, which is, my tea is touching, in that sense that it's like emotionally touching the reader. It's giving them a visceral experience. It's connecting them to a world they may not know about. My E is edgy, because my stuff is definitely very edgy, and scary, and kind of edgier seat kind of stuff. Maybe edgier seat would be a better E. And my A was action, because I love writing entertaining big set pieces, which means like, I love having like big dramatic events happen with my characters. And, in my stories, there's a lot of like earthquakes and volcanoes and buildings collapsing. And I kind of like epics. I like things on an epic scale. So now I want to change my E to epic. But anyway, so yeah, so touching, edgy, and action would be my edge.
Well, you can change your tea at any time, because that's what it is, right? Our teas are different. We serve different flavors and different blends each and every day, in each and every moment, right? So it can change within seconds. But this is what we do, is we teach through our teas, and we teach how we are and why we serve the way we do, and the purpose behind writing. And that for you, it was horror. It really grabbed you. And I love the word edgy, because I have read some little intros into some of your books, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like, yeah. And I'm one of those freaks that I'm scared of horror, but I watch horror. So my son gets a real kick out of watching horrors with me. He's like, Mom, it's coming. And then I'll be like, okay, I'll cover my eyes. And then he'll be like, Mom, it's already done. And I'll put it down. And that's when it catches me. So I'm one of those kind of people watching horror movies and reading. And especially when I'm reading, if it gets too scary, I'll actually drop the book. I'm like, let's just drop it and leave it there for a bit.
I've had that experience. I was watching, and I'm the same way about movies. I'm a chicken when it comes to horror movies. I do watch them with my wife, but I do a lot of this when I'm scared, but I don't like the jump scares. but yeah, I remember there was a time when I was reading, when I was a kid, and I was reading The Shining by Stephen King.
That
I
is
was
the
reading,
movie that scares the crap out of me.
I
Like,
was
I
reading
mean,
the
like,
book, and I was like, I think I was probably like 13, maybe 13, 14. And I had to put it down because I was too scared to go on. And that's the only time that's ever happened to me. But I'll always remember it because it was such an impactful moment for me, as a writer and a reader, that I was like, how cool is it? Like, it didn't bother me. I thought it was really cool that I was like, I need to take a moment because this is too intense. And I had to put the book down. It's the only time it's happened. But if I have a goal, is to someday write something so scary that people might have to put the book down for a minute, and go watch the butterflies and birds, and then come back to the scary stuff.
so The Shining is one of the movies that has scared you too?
The Shining is a very scary movie. Yeah, the book is I think even more scary than the movie is.
It is.
It's really terrifying. Because lots happens in the book that doesn't happen in the movie. But yeah, that's a pretty scary book. I think that and
I think we got
it. But he's written a bunch of them.
We had a glitch there for a few seconds. So if you just want to repeat that, Philip. Can you hear me, Philip? Oh, did we get a glitch? We talked about The Shining, and look, we got glitches.
Now you're back. Yeah. How scary is that? Yeah. See, I was waiting for your screen to go to static and something to come at me from the static. But
yeah.
No, it didn't happen. Just do it. Thank goodness.
So has there been any books that you've read of other authors out there that have scared you besides The Shining?
Well, the Stephen King ones I mentioned. There's a book called Weave World, written by Clive Barker, that was pretty scary. Peter Straub wrote a book called Ghost Story that was pretty scary. There's a few. There's one is a lesser known book written by Jonathan Aycliffe, that I can't really remember the title of. That really shook me up when I read it. So every now and then you'll come across this. There's a popular book called Bird Box, which was written by Josh Malerman, and then there was a Netflix movie made out of that. But in the book, there's a very scary scene where the character, the lead character is she's pregnant, she's having her baby, and there's kind of this storm outside, and the house that they're hiding in is under attack, and all these things are kind of happening at the same time. And it's one of the most intense scenes I've ever read in a novel. And that scene in that book really shook me up. And I kind of think of that scene as a master class in how to write a scary horror scene, because Josh really knocked it out of the park with Bird Box, and that scene in particular always sticks with me.
Is there a reason why some of the books are better than the movies? Like, why they leave the good stuff out? Because I've noticed that I'll read a book and I'll be like, why didn't they put that in the movie?
Yeah, I think with movies is, having done, some adaptions of novels to screen, the biggest problem is you just don't have time. To really do if you were to put everything that's in a novel into a movie, you're talking about a 6-hour movie probably at a minimum. So I think what they do is they kind of have to pick and choose what goes and what stays, and they kind of pick their thread, if you will, their plot thread that they want to adapt to the screen, and they kind of have to leave everything else out. But there's interesting, because if you take The Godfather, for instance, The Godfather is interesting. Look at this, because the movie, the very famous first movie, Godfather, is really only about half the book, and there's another third of the book that that never made it into any of the Godfather movies. But then there's another third of the book that basically became a majority of Godfather Part 2. So they actually used one book to make two movies essentially. And so I think that's interesting. but yeah, I think why some of the reason you're seeing, I think, a lot more, these limited series that are on Netflix or HBO Max or whatever. I think because they need that time to tell, when it's adapting a novel, they need all that time, like the 6 hours or 8 hours or whatever it is to tell the whole story. Like, and like people have tried to adapt. Going back to Stephen King, they tried to adapt his novel The Stand, which is a 1,000-page novel, and there's no way to do that unless you're going to do it over eight hours because it's just too much going on. But I think the reason you don't see a lot of the good stuff in a movie that you read in a book is because they just don't have time. And it stinks, right? When like there's a character you like or a part of the book that you like that doesn't get transferred over to the movie. It's disappointing, but but that's, you have to kind of pick and choose what makes it and what doesn't. So it's the opposite. Like if you have a short story that's adapted to a feature film, for example, it's actually the opposite. You have to kind of flesh out what happens in the short story because there's usually not enough content in the story to make a whole movie. So you have to kind of like come up with a lot of new stuff to kind of fill out the story for a full film. So it's interesting when you do adaptations like that. Sometimes they get smaller and sometimes they get bigger.
Well, and sometimes they put in the part where you're like, well, why did they put that one in and not the other one, right? You're like, yeah. When I read a book and then I watch a movie, I'm like, oh. So you always decide, right? Was the movie better? Was the book better, right?
Sometimes they just take kind of the core conceit of the book and they kind of do their own thing with it. So, a lot of times they change so much of the book that isn't even recognizable as the book anymore. So yeah, there's different ways of doing it.
So Philip, you're writing a bunch of books. You have some that are coming out, but the one that I put onto the poster when we shared about you coming on Teatime was the Beneath the Pale Sky. Oh, I think we got disconnected. So hopefully he'll come back and then we can jump into the Pale Sky and then we'll find out more about what Philip does and what his future plans are for his books and all that good stuff. So there might be some disconnection. There are weather happening over there. So we'll just keep going. Oh, and he's back. So let's get him back in here. There we go. We got a little jump. Can you hear me, Philip? Are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I got kicked out, but I'm back.
Yeah, I seen that. I was just like, oh, well, look, we talk about movies and we talk about books and look at poof, we get kicked out, right? We talk about The Shining and look, we get the glitches. It's all that horror stuff that just keeps popping in. So any future plans for any of your books, Philip? Like, do you want to have them in movies or would you like to see them in the big screens? Or
yeah, so I would. I mean, I've optioned a few short stories to different producers and studios. I have optioned a novel that's already, they've already written the screenplay for the first episode. It would be a TV show, I think. So yeah, I'm working on a few things on that. I mentioned the screenplay I just wrote based on one of my own short stories, which was optioned. So yeah, and I have definitely want, it's great for a writer, a fiction writer, to have their stories and novels adapted for film and TV, frankly, because film and TV pays really well, and publishing historically does not pay all that well. So it's an opportunity for a guy like me to make a little bit more money so that I can keep writing the new stories and stuff like that. So it's kind of it's a great way to kind of capitalize on some of the stories that you've created. So it's always a good thing to option something for film and TV. So yeah, I think right now I've got 4 short stories that are being developed by different producers and studios, and I've got 1 novel that's being developed. So hopefully I can find some interest for the other 2 novels that are coming out. But I think once they get closer to being released, I think that'll pick up a little bit. The interest will pick up. So we'll see. But right now, that's all I have really planned, and nothing has been officially announced other than Death My Old Friend, which I mentioned. There was a big announcement that went out about that. So hopefully that goes into production next year. That's the hope.
Oh, that's cool. I'll keep my eyes open for that, and I'll be like, oh, I had him on Tea Time. So before you got your glitch and before you got bumped out, we were talking about Beneath a Pale Sky. If you want to
Hmm.
talk to the viewers and listeners out there a little bit about that, because that's the book that I actually put up on your poster when we were broadcasting for Tea Time. So if you want to share a little bit about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so Beneath the Pale Sky is a story collection. So it is, I believe, 9 stories, maybe 8 stories. I can't remember exactly. And it's my second story collection. My first story collection is called Behold the Void, which came out in 2017. And yeah, and it was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award, and it got some really great recognition. Um, and it's basically just it's just a collection of stories. Some of the stories are long, like probably close to 50 pages. Some of the stories are very short, like I think the last story, "Death My Old Friend," I think is only like 10 pages, maybe. So interesting. That's the one that's being adapted to a film. So there's a lot of expansion going on. But yeah, so it's I would classify it as thrillers with the supernatural angle. So they there's a lot of kind of epic tragedy in a lot of those stories. No real tropes, no vampires, no mummies, no zombies. It's more real people in everyday settings that kind of go topsy turvy into different kind of realms of horror. So yeah, it's gotten a really great response. I think I've got 4.5 stars on Amazon and Goodreads. Um, so yeah, so I'm really pleased with the response, because you never really know how people will respond to a book, or in a collection of stories, even more so, because some people will like one story and not like another story. I've had reviewers say, literally, I'm not even making this up. Like, if you look at my Goodreads page, one guy will say, my favorite story was X and my least favorite story was Y, and the very next person will say the exact opposite. My favorite story was Y, my least favorite story was X. So readers all like different things. It's all subjective. It's all art. So art is subjective. So you just try and kind of create the best stories that you can and write them the best way you know how, and hope that more people like them than not like them. But yeah, so that's a story collection that I'm very excited about and proud of. And I'll have a new story collection coming out next October that's called No One Is Safe, and that'll be another collection of stories. So and then between now and then, I have 2 novels coming out.
So the No One Is Safe, that's going to be multiple stories in that book, right?
Yeah, that'll be like 14 stories, I believe,
Oh,
if
wow.
memory serves. Yeah, it'll be a kind of a yeah, that one. Sometimes when you write a story collection, because what you're doing is you're taking all these stories that you've published all these different places, and you're kind of putting them together it's like a record. It's like an album. You want the songs, you want there to be sort of a theme to it. It's like a hard rock album, or it's a ballads, or whatever it is. So I think with writing, you try and have a theme so that readers don't feel like they're kind of you know being jarred too much, like between one story and the next story. So you try and make it somewhat consistent as far as how this kind of stories they are. So I think with Beneath the Pale Sky, the stories are kind of, like I said, more like epic tragedies. They're based in reality. The characters are very real people you could walk down the street and see every day. I think with the next collection of stories, it's going to be more like pulpy. It'll be more like monsters and more, a little bit probably more tropes and stuff like that. Where I think there's even a vampire story. So it's gonna be kind of more like, just for kind of more on the fun, crazy side. So that's kind of what I'm going with. A little bit darker, I guess. But so yeah, so I think you try and kind of come up with different ways of presenting your stories in a book, so that uh, there's sort of, like I said, like there's like a kind of general sense of a theme for each book. And Beneath the Pale Sky is also thematically kind of deals a lot with the afterlife. So there's a lot of stories about that kind of bleed into sort of what happens after you die. There's kind of like there's a sense of purgatory, of other worlds beyond these, as it were. So that's kind of a recurring theme in a lot of the stories. in Beneath the Pale Sky.
Well, I noticed that there's a theme with most of your books. There's a lot of time travel, right? There's a lot of afterlife, you know, family history as well. So, like when I read a
Yeah,
little bit about the Beneath the Pale Sky, it was about the different stories, right? From I'm just quickly looking over my notes here. The mental hospital and that. I noticed that there's a lot of that in a lot of your books. Uh, the, and I think horror does go back to the mental hospitals and the mental health and all that, right?
yeah. I mean, that was an interesting story to write, which is, yeah. So the story you're referring to is called ID, which is about, yeah, it's about a guy who's in a mental hospital, and it's his perspective of reality. And so yeah, you can kind of, I mean, there's definitely a lot of in the genre, there's definitely a lot of opportunities to I think Edgar Allan Poe, wrote a lot about madness. Um, and I think that's kind of something that's definitely part of the genre, is sort of like, what does it feel like to maybe slowly lose your mind? What does it feel like to think you're crazy, or for other people to think you're crazy? And that's kind of scary, right? Because it's a different kind of fear. It's not, there's a monster under your bed kind of fear. It's more of a fear of not knowing who you are, and not having a sense of yourself. And that's kind of like, it can be a disorienting feeling. And I think the way I wrote that story very purposely, I kind of wrote it to be sort of disorienting. It's laid out in a sort of disorienting fashion. There are some pages that have one sentence on them. There are some pages that have, a paragraph. And the way it's told from different characters' perspectives is, you don't really know 100% sure. You're never really 100% sure what's happening, but you're kind of carried along because you're kind of going with whatever this guy is thinking and feeling. So yeah, that was an interesting story to write. It was kind of an experimental story for me, but a lot of people really gravitated to it, and I get a lot of really positive response about it. So that was nice to hear.
Oh, well, that's good. So before we wrap up your tea time, because we're getting almost close to the hour here, Philip, you gave me the word thankful for a word to describe you as a person. Why that word?
I think I'm just, I'm one of those guys that has, I've been through a lot, and I've had a lot of different lives, sort of thing. I've had a lot of different experiences. I've met a lot of wide range of people, and through those experiences, and I think, I'm I'm the kind of person that really um, appreciates what I have. And I think when you are an artist, from or writer or a musician or whatever it is, I think there are some people who feel like, well, you should like what I'm doing because because I did it and I'm telling you it's good. I don't care what. And I think I'm the kind of guy that really appreciates people who read my work, because I know how people have a lot of different things that they could be reading, and I think and buying. And so I'm really always very appreciative whenever anybody reads my work, when they review my work. I'm very appreciative and thankful when a publisher likes my work enough to buy it and to put it out around the world in a book form. I appreciate those things, and I'm always very grateful when those things happen, because I know they just as easily could not happen. So I think it's just kind of my attitude, is I'm just kind of, and just the way I think my personality is, and my mindset is, whenever something good happens, I never assume that it's, something that should have happened regardless because of something I did. I feel like it's somebody else is contributing to me and to my life. And so I always am very grateful and thankful for that kind of thing. Cause I've been in situations, a lot of situations where, you know, where you don't have anything, and there's no one helping you, and you're kind of, and you got nowhere to go. And you kind of have, you don't have a sense of how you're going to get out of that situation. So now I'm in a position where, things are stable and my life is good. And I'm having these opportunities, and I'm continuing to work hard to keep those opportunities alive. And then, but it takes somebody else to make those opportunities real, right? Somebody else has to buy the book, somebody else has to read the story, somebody else has to, publish the book. So that's why I say thankful, because I know that it's nothing that I could do on my own. There has to be somebody else willing to support me so that I can do what I want to do.
And for any of the viewers and listeners out there that would like to reach out to you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
The best way is through my website, which is pfracassi.com, or I'm also very active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So I'm kind of on the main social media platform. So, and you can message me through Facebook or Twitter, or through my website. You can email me. There's a contact link. So those are the best ways to contact me.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Philip, for joining me today and having tea with me. You really served a strong, good cup of tea, and you gave me a lot of information, a lot to sit back and learn about. And for all the listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in to Tea Time. I really appreciate all the love and support that you bring to the table each and every Thursday. That's right. We're here on Thursdays, and then we're also here on Sundays on the radio if you'd like to hear Miss Liz serve a different type of tea with music and recipes and all that fun fact stuff. So I want to thank you, Philip, for closing up my September month. It was an awesome September. I had some really incredible guests that joined me in September. So, Philip, thank you again for joining me. I really am appreciative of each and every one of you guests coming on and serving your teas and bringing education to the table through different ways, through horror tonight. So I want to thank you for that. And we are starting September. We are starting October. We are almost ending September already. It is that quick. So in October, we do have 5 new guests that are coming. So we do have clown education. We have creative writing. We have self-publishing. We have journalism and history, and we have historical fiction. So we have some really good topics coming to the table in October. So be sure to check that out as well. And again, Philip, thank you so much for joining me tonight and serving your tea. And any final words before we close up?
No. I appreciate being here and for you having me. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. And I will see everybody on October 6th with a new cup of tea and a new story to bring education to the table.